Chapter 1. The war didn't end with the airstrikes. The supreme leader is dead, but the regime is not. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched massive strikes on Iran. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed. Israel said roughly 200 aircraft hit around 500 targets across the country. On paper, that sounds like the kind of blow that should end a system. But that is not how regimes collapse. You can decapitate a government from the air. You can destroy command centers, missile sites, and leadership compounds. You can create panic. But you cannot govern a country from 30,000 feet. You cannot secure streets, border crossings, prisons, ministries, and neighborhoods with fighter jets alone. That is the real problem, now. Because this war is no longer just about bombing Iran. It is about what comes after the bombing. And that is where one name has returned to the center of the story. The Kurds. Not a state. Not a regular army. Not a country with a seat at the United Nations. But a nation-sized people, scattered across Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. Living on top of one of the most sensitive fault lines in the Middle East. And suddenly, they are being discussed again as a possible ground variable in a war that may decide the future of Iran. That is the part most people are missing. The biggest question in this war is no longer whether Iran can be hit. We already know it can. The real question is who fills the vacuum if the regime starts to crack. And to understand why the Kurds are back in that conversation, you have to go back more than a century. To a map that was promised, and then erased. Chapter 2. The country that was promised, then deleted. The Kurds are one of the largest stateless peoples in the world. Depending on the estimate, there are somewhere between roughly 30 million and more than 40 million Kurds spread across the Middle East. They live mostly in the mountainous belt that stretches across southeastern Turkey, western Iran, northern Iraq, and northeastern Syria. And the key point is this. The Kurds did not simply fail to build a country. Because they were too weak. At one point, a political path existed. Then it was taken away. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And the victorious powers began redrawing the map of the Middle East. In the Treaty of Sèvres, there was language that opened the door to Kurdish autonomy. But that door did not stay open for long. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne replaced it. The Kurdish provisions disappeared. The map was redrawn. And the Kurds were split across 4 states. That is where the modern Kurdish question really begins. Not as a simple minority issue, but as a geopolitical wound. A people large enough to imagine statehood, but trapped inside borders built by other empires, for other interests. And that is why every Kurdish uprising is larger than it looks. When Kurds move, this is never just about one protest or one militia. It raises a much bigger fear. What happens if the border stops being permanent? What happens if an internal rebellion turns into a map problem? For Iran, that means territorial integrity. For Turkey, it means the nightmare of Kurdish separatism spreading across its own southeast. For Iraq and Syria, it means the possibility that their already fragile internal order could crack even further. So when people say the Kurds are suddenly becoming important in this war, that is not really true. The truth is, they have always been important. The region has just spent 100 years trying to keep that fact contained. And among all the states that divided Kurdish lands, Iran occupies a special place in Kurdish memory. Because with Iran, this is not just about discrimination. It is about betrayal, repression, exile, and unfinished revenge. Chapter 3. Why Iran and the Kurds carry such deep hostility. Millions of Kurds live inside Iran today, mostly in the western border provinces near Iraq and Turkey. The estimates vary, but the range is huge. Some put the number at around 7 million. Others place it much higher. What matters more than the exact figure is their position. They are a large population concentrated along a strategic frontier, with a long history of political exclusion, cultural pressure, and security crackdowns. And for Kurdish political memory, one date matters enormously: 1946. That year, in the city of Mahabad in northwestern Iran, Kurdish leaders established the Republic of Mahabad. It was short-lived, less than a year. But for the Kurds, that brief moment became historic, because it proved something. They could govern. They could educate in their own language. They could build institutions. For a moment, the Kurdish future was not theoretical. It was visible. Then it was crushed. When Soviet protection disappeared, Iranian forces moved back in. The republic fell. Kurdish leader Qazi Muhammad was executed. What remained was not just trauma. It was a memory of almost statehood. A vision that failed, but never vanished. And then came another turning point. 1979. The Iranian Revolution. Many Kurds initially supported the fall of the Shah. They believed the old order was ending, and that maybe, finally, some form of autonomy would emerge. But what came next was the opposite. The new Islamic Republic saw Kurdish demands not as a legitimate political claim, but as a threat to central authority. Ayatollah Khomeini denounced Kurdish opposition. Armed conflict followed. What some Kurds had hoped would be a revolutionary opening became a counter-revolution against them. That matters today, because it shaped the basic Kurdish view of Tehran. Not as a government that misunderstood them. Not as a rival political faction. But as a state that repeatedly responds to Kurdish demands with force. And this did not end in the 1980s. In 2018, Iran's Revolutionary Guards launched missile strikes on Iranian Kurdish opposition sites in northern Iraq. The message was unmistakable. The border would not protect Kurdish dissidents. Tehran was willing to reach across it. That is why, from the Kurdish point of view, this war is not some abstract geopolitical contest between Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran. It is personal. It is layered. It is historical. And then, in 2022, one young woman's death turned that Kurdish grievance into a national Iranian crisis. Chapter 4. After Gina Amini, the Kurds were already on the front line. The world knows her as Masa Amini, but her Kurdish name was Gina. And that detail matters, because the story was never only about hijab enforcement or morality police abuse. It was also about identity, language, and who gets to exist inside the Islamic Republic on their own terms. Gina Amini, a young Kurdish woman, died after being detained by Iran's morality police in September 2022. Her death ignited one of the biggest waves of unrest the Islamic Republic had faced in decades. And the slogan that spread across Iran carried Kurdish roots. Woman, life, freedom. That chant did not come from nowhere. It came from Kurdish political and feminist tradition, then spread beyond Kurdish regions and became the language of a national uprising. That is the point. The Kurds did not suddenly appear in 2026 because war broke out. They were already at the center of Iran's internal fracture lines. They were already paying a disproportionate price whenever the system shook. When protests surged again in early 2026, Kurdish regions once again became some of the most volatile and heavily repressed areas. The exact death toll remains contested. Different actors have pushed very different numbers. But the broader pattern is clear. Whenever Iran enters a legitimacy crisis, Kurdish areas tend to become both an early warning zone and a punishment zone. And then something even more important happened. Iranian Kurdish opposition groups, long divided by ideology, rivalry, and history, began coordinating more seriously. Groups that had not trusted each other started aligning around a shared judgment that the Islamic Republic was entering one of the most dangerous periods in its history. That matters, because insurgencies do not become strategically relevant overnight. First, they become politically ready. Then they wait for a moment when the state weakens enough to make movement possible. By the time the airstrikes began in late February, the Kurdish question was not being born. It was being reopened. And there was one outside player that had been thinking about this possibility for much longer than most people realize. Not Washington first. Israel. Chapter 5. Why Israel has looked at the Kurds for decades. Israel's relationship with the Kurds did not begin with this war. It goes back decades. As early as the 1960s, Israel was building ties with Kurdish actors in Iraq. Intelligence contacts, military coordination, political signaling. Later, Israeli leaders would openly express sympathy for Kurdish statehood, especially when Kurdish aspirations could weaken hostile states around them. And this relationship makes sense if you look at it through strategy, not sentiment. Israel has long believed that one way to survive in the Middle East is not only to confront enemies directly, but to exploit their internal vulnerabilities. If a hostile state has an internal pressure point, and that pressure point can absorb military attention, political energy, and security resources, that becomes useful. That is how the Kurds were often seen. Not simply as an oppressed people, though they were. Not simply as a moral cause, though many framed them that way, but as a pressure mechanism inside rival states. A force that could tie down Iraq in the past, and now potentially complicate Iran. That logic is resurfacing now. Because if you are Israel, then you have already struck the top of the Iranian system from the air. The next question is obvious. What internal forces can make that damage harder to contain? Who can stretch Iranian security forces? Who can raise the cost of regime stabilization? Who can force Tehran to fight on more than one layer at once? The Kurds fit that logic almost perfectly. They know the terrain. They already have armed organizations. They already have a history of resistance. They already operate in the exact western regions that matter most in any border-centered destabilization scenario. But that does not mean this is a clean alliance. Far from it. Because old relationships do not guarantee new commitments. And in Kurdish history, foreign interest has often looked promising right up until the moment it disappears. That is what makes the current moment so dangerous. The Kurds may be strategically valuable again. But value is not the same thing as protection. And that brings us to the most important question of this war. What exactly is happening now between the United States, Israel, and Iranian Kurdish factions? The answer is, enough to matter, but not enough to trust. Chapter 6. The Kurds are no longer background noise. They are a ground variable. Recent reporting suggests that Iranian Kurdish armed groups have been in discussions with the United States about whether and how to strike Iranian security forces in the west of the country. That alone is significant. It means the Kurdish issue is no longer sitting on the sidelines as a humanitarian footnote. It has entered active war planning conversations. Some reports have gone further, suggesting requests for military assistance, possible covert support, and contingency planning for cross-border operations. Other reports say Israel had been engaging these groups for months before the war. But this is where caution matters. Because not every discussion becomes a decision. Not every signal becomes a policy. And not every leak is proof of execution. This is the fog of war zone, where operational reality, political pressure, psychological messaging, and media narratives all blur together. Some reports describe thousands of Kurdish fighters potentially preparing for operations linked to the US-Israel campaign. Kurdish authorities in Iraq, however, publicly denied that their territory was being used as a launchpad for attacks into Iran. That contradiction tells you a lot. Everyone sees the strategic possibility, but not everyone wants ownership of it. And then there is President Trump's own messaging, which has not exactly reduced the uncertainty. At one moment, he appeared to welcome the idea of Kurdish movement across the border. Shortly afterward, he publicly suggested he did not want Kurdish involvement, because the conflict was already complicated enough. That is a familiar pattern in Kurdish history. Encouragement without commitment. Strategic use without strategic guarantee. The Kurds hear the opening, but they also hear the escape hatch. So here is the honest read. The Kurdish role in this war is no longer theoretical. It is now part of the live strategic conversation. But whether that role becomes a full-scale ground front is still unresolved. And that uncertainty is not a side detail. It is the story. Because as soon as the Kurdish option becomes real, another country's alarm bells start going off immediately. Turkey. And once Turkey enters the equation, this stops being just a war against Iran. It becomes a test of the entire regional order. Chapter 7. This could be an opportunity. It could also be a trap. For Turkey, the Kurdish question is existential. For more than 4 decades, Ankara has fought the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, in a conflict that has killed tens of thousands. So when Turkey looks at Iranian Kurdish armed groups, especially ones it sees as linked ideologically or organizationally to the PKK, it does not see liberation. It sees contagion. That is why the Kurdish variable is so explosive. The United States may see pressure on Iran. Israel may see a useful second front. But Turkey may see the reactivation of a Kurdish militant ecosystem it has spent decades trying to crush. And if that happens, the lines between ally and adversary get messy very quickly. A NATO member can oppose the very dynamic Washington finds useful. Ankara may dislike Tehran, but that does not mean it wants Iranian Kurdish autonomy to become a reality. In fact, from Turkey's perspective, an Iranian regime collapse that empowers Kurdish actors near its borders could be even worse than a wounded Islamic Republic that stays intact. This is how one issue can reverse an entire map of alignments. And the warning signs do not only come from states. They also come from other Kurds. In Syria, Kurdish groups that have already worked with the United States against the Islamic State have reportedly cautioned Iranian Kurds against trusting Washington too easily. Why? Because they have lived this story before. They know what it means to bleed alongside the United States, only to discover later that battlefield value does not automatically turn into post-war protection. That is the heart of the Kurdish dilemma. The moment of opportunity is real, but so is the probability of abandonment. And American intelligence reporting has apparently reflected some of that cold realism. Even if Kurdish fighters can create pressure, it remains unclear whether they have the manpower, firepower, and political cohesion needed to sustain a long confrontation with Iranian state forces on their own. In other words, they may be useful enough to open the fight, but not strong enough to finish it. And that is one of the most dangerous positions any people can occupy in war. Important enough to be used, not strong enough to dictate the outcome. That is why this story is not just about Kurdish courage or Kurdish grievance. It is about incentives. Who benefits if the Kurds move? Who pays if the plan stalls? Who carries the risk of retaliation? And who gets to walk away if the battlefield math changes? To answer that, we have to come back to the biggest emotional force in this whole story. Why the Kurds might still decide to move anyway. Chapter 8. 100-Year Dream. And the fear of being used again. Why would the Kurds step into a war like this, knowing the danger? Because for them, this may look like the kind of moment that comes once in a generation, if that. First, there is history. For decades, Kurdish movements have carried the memory of lost statehood, failed uprisings, crushed autonomy, and delayed self-determination. From Mohammed to modern insurgencies, the pattern is familiar. A crack opens. Hope rises. Outside powers lean in. Then the door closes. Second, there is timing. The Islamic Republic has been shaken from above by external strikes and from below by years of internal discontent. If there is ever a moment when the balance of fear inside Iran might weaken enough to make Kurdish gains possible, this may be it. Third, there is accumulated rage. Not just abstract oppression. Concrete memory. Executions. Exile. Missile strikes. Political repression. Cultural suppression. Repeated punishment by a state that Kurdish communities do not see as a neutral authority, but as a historical enforcer. So yes, there is strategy here. But there is also emotion. There is revenge. There is identity. There is the belief that history does not wait forever. And yet, the uncomfortable truth is that the United States has a long record of treating Kurdish aspirations as tactical assets rather than strategic commitments. That is why this story matters so much to an American audience. Because it forces a hard question. Is Washington once again moving toward a model where air power is American, but blood on the ground belongs to someone else? If Kurdish forces open a Western front inside Iran, the immediate risks fall on Kurdish towns, Kurdish fighters, Kurdish families, and Kurdish political networks. If the plan works, larger powers gain leverage. If it fails, those same powers can reduce their exposure far more easily than the Kurds can. That is not just a regional problem. That is a moral and strategic pattern. And the cost is not confined to the battlefield either. This war is already rattling energy markets and shipping routes. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical choke points in the global oil system. If instability deepens, American consumers feel it in gas prices. Investors feel it in volatility. Policymakers feel it in inflation pressure, alliance management, and the risk of another open-ended Middle East crisis. So the Kurdish question is not some niche ethnic subplot. It sits right at the intersection of regime change, alliance tension, border stability, and global energy risk. That is why this story matters. Because the death of a supreme leader is dramatic. But it is not the final chapter. The final chapter will be written by whoever shapes the map after the shock. And right now, one of the most dangerous names waiting just outside that new map is the Kurds. So here is the real question. Is this finally the moment when the Kurds stop being history's most useful abandoned ally? Or are they once again being invited into a war just early enough to bleed? And just late enough to be denied the peace? That is not only the Kurdish question. It may become the question that defines what this war was really for.